Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 8 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the New Jersey Devils and lost by a score of 3-1. And unfortunately, we do have to cut these celebrations short. It was only 24 hours ago where the Sharks picked up their first victory of the season against the New York Rangers, but it was always going to be a very difficult task to actually string a couple of wins together here because their next opponent the very next day was against a very good New Jersey Devils team who came into tonight, I believe, on a 6-game winning streak. And so really the ultimate goal here for San Jose was to not just get completely blown out. If you go back to the last time this season that the Sharks faced off against a powerhouse Eastern Conference opponent, that was the Carolina Hurricanes back in Game 3, and the Sharks got absolutely destroyed in that game. And so looking for a little bit of a better result here, and that's actually what the Sharks got. Yes, this is a loss, and previously I had talked about how, these moral victories don't really mean much when the Sharks hadn't won a game this season, but now they have, and you can be a little bit more positive and put a bit more of a positive spin on things, and I think that the Sharks held their own here against a really, really good team. In fact, they had the better of the looks in the first period of this game. That's actually been a theme across this entire road trip thus far. A great start against the Islanders and against the Rangers, and here tonight against the Devils. They scored the only goal of this opening frame. That comes from William Eklund on the power play. That makes it 1-0. It would then appear that the Sharks would have scored a second goal from Philip Kurashev on a tip-in from Sam Dickinson, but unfortunately, his first career point will have to wait a little bit longer as it ends up getting called back on a high touch, and so it remains a precarious 1-goal lead heading into the second period. And just as the first has treated the Sharks well on this road trip, the second has treated them rather poorly. It has been a struggle, and that continued here tonight. Now, it started off well, where it seemed as though the Sharks would be expanding their lead to 2-0 this time as Jeff Skinner scored, but after a lengthy amount of time, the Devils finally decide to challenge it on offside, and it does get called back. And this is where we do get to see a little bit of an oddity with the NHL rulebook. Now, usually when a goal gets called back for offside, they rewind the clock back to the time that the infraction did happen. But what ended up being the case on this goal is that Wenberg was offside. A few seconds later, the Devils took a penalty, and then a couple seconds after that, that's when Jeff Skinner scored. And yet, with rewinding the clock, you would think that the penalty would be nullified because it would have never had to happen in the first place if the whistle originally was blown for offside, but it did still stand, so it benefited the San Jose Sharks here. However, they were unable to capitalize on that, which is the exact opposite of what we saw from the New Jersey Devils in this middle frame, because the Sharks had a bit of a march to the penalty box. Some of these penalties were deserved, like the Vincent Iorio delay of game. That's very straightforward, but some were definitely pretty weak. In particular, that Jeff Skinner hooking call really stands out. I have no idea why this ended up getting called for a hook. This is completely sold by Devils forward Dawson Mercer, and it feels even worse because I believe it is the penalty that leads to the power play game winner here by Dougie Hamilton that makes it 2-1, so really, really bad situation. However, the Sharks' penalty kill is kind of what lets them down here. Yes, they did have the good kill on the 5-on-3. That let them survive a little bit longer in this game, but still 2 power play goals against. The Sharks actually coming into this game already had a penalty kill that was below 70%. That's not very good, and so this is definitely one of many areas, of course, that do need to see a significant improvement in. Now, when it comes to the actual even strength play, we do have to, talk about the elephant in the room here of this second period, which is that the Sharks had a grand total of 0 shots on goal, very much similar to the third period against the Carolina Hurricanes, where they also had 0 shots. The fact that just 8 games into the season they've had 2 periods like this is not a great sign, but I will say if you actually take a look at the shot attempts at 5-on-5 instead for this middle frame, it paints a little bit of a different picture. Still, the Devils have the advantage, but it's not a significant one, and so I actually didn't hate the Sharks' second period performance when it came to 5-on-5 play. In general, across this full 60 minutes, I thought the Sharks defended decently well. This was almost certainly their best defensive game, again, at even strength, of this entire season. Not saying much because they've been terrible defensively thus far, but this is a step in the right direction. I don't want to say that, a certain player being out of the lineup maybe does help out in that regard, but it's something that perhaps should not be ignored. Now, when it comes to the third period here, this is where the Sharks are going to look to try and make that comeback, and they do finally get a shot on goal to Jake Allen, who basically had to do very little for a good 30 minutes of this game, and the Sharks got more than just a shot. They had some decent chances from Gaudette, from Celebrini, from Toffoli, but Jake Allen was there each and every time, and eventually Connor Brown adds the empty netter. That makes it 3-1, and that's the final score here. But like I said, now that you have that victory in the win column there for yourselves, you're feeling a little bit better, and a game like this doesn't get you down as much because you put up a good fight against a great team. When it comes to the players to talk about here, we first have to talk about the player who steps out of the lineup for this game because Kurashev ends up joining the third line here for Graf and Gaudet. And of course, the player who steps out is Michael Misa. Now, Warsofsky did specify that this is not for performance-related reasons and instead is strictly a development day, but it's something that I still don't quite agree with, because if we go back to last season, as we know, Will Smith got 5 development days across the first month of the season, and many people point to that as like, oh, well, it worked for Will Smith, who eventually ended up having a great year. But the correlation between those two things is, to me, kind of like tenuous at best. His 5 development days through October and November directly relate to him turning things on in late January. I'm not entirely sure if that's true. And the big difference is that Will Smith in October and November really wasn't making much of an impact on the ice. Like, him being taken out of the lineup didn't actually hurt the Sharks all that much. Remember, it took until game 9 of the season for Smith, his 9th game, when he got his finally first point. But you take a look at a guy like Michael Misa, he's already looked pretty settled in to the NHL at this point. Yes, his first night against Carolina wasn't great, but the entire team was awful, so I'm not going to single out Michael Misa. And then he has looked quite good against Pittsburgh, against the Islanders, and against the Rangers thus far, including 2 points for himself across these 4 games, 2 even strength points, which is even more impressive. And so to me, especially considering fatigue isn't much of an issue here because he only played 10 minutes of ice time, just barely, against the Rangers. And even though this is a road game back-to-back, you're essentially walking down the street to go from the Rangers to the Devils. That's an exaggeration, but not a significant one. You would think that Misa should be able to play this back-to-back and would be deserving of such a thing as well. Because remember, Smith, there were those development days at the beginning of the season, but once he kind of settled in a little bit more, through the end of November into December, those went away. He started playing every single game, at least if he was healthy enough to, and that's kind of where Michael Misa is at. He's not at that explosiveness that we saw from Smith in the second half, but he's at that point where he can be a contributing player in the lineup, game in and game out. And so the big thing here is that you're not only hurting Michael Misa, but you're hurting the team as a whole. Just look at how effective this third line has been over these last couple of games. Him, Graf, and Gaudet have combined for back-to-back games with even strength goals, and this might not seem all that crazy or all that impressive, but it's important to remember that the Sharks were the lowest scoring team in the NHL last year and the second lowest team the year before that. This is not a team that can really take any amount of goals for granted, and you're not going to have Macklin Celebrini put up 5 points every single night. You need that depth to show up, and Misa with Graf and Gaudet were capable of doing that in these games, and so by removing Misa from the equation now, you do hurt your lineup a good bit. And so I did not like this decision from Ryan Warsofsky. To me, I think Misa should be an every night lineup player, more or less, unless he really begins to struggle, because we have not yet seen that. And so I was not too happy to see him sitting this one out. When it comes to the actual lineup for this game, we have the top group of Toffoli, Celebrini, and Smith. They were always going to come back down to earth from the previous game. You're not expecting, as I said, Celebrini to be a 5-point player every single night. Nobody is actually capable of sustaining that type of output, and especially going up against a team like the New Jersey Devils, it was going to be a lot more difficult to come by that open ice, which was something that they were able to make a ton of use of against the New York Rangers. And yet, I was still pretty impressed with this top group. They had some really difficult matchups. The Devils have a strong defensive team. They have one of the best defensive centers in the NHL, and Nico Hischier, who's in like that same type of conversation as a guy like Alexander Barkov. And they've got great blue liners as well. Not who like steal the headlines or anything like a Cale Makar or a Quinn Hughes by putting up immense amount of points, but guys who are just very good in their own end. A Brett Pesce, a Luke Hughes, a Jonas Siegenthaler. So there's not a ton of open ice. There's not a ton of chances, and you really got to work for your opportunities. And I thought this trio actually did a good job of that. But the player who really does stand out is actually Will Smith. Because the thing is that if you look at a guy like Celebrini, yes, there's a ton to love offensively here, like we saw yesterday. yesterday, but he is capable of making an impact on this game no matter what, even if it's offensively not really rolling. And so he can jump into these puck battles and get into the trenches with his team and really do some hard work. Smith doesn't quite have that ability, at least not yet. He's much more of an offensive player, and so you would think on a night like this game against the New Jersey Devils, where the Sharks have an entire period where they don't even get a shot on goal, that Smith must have not been particularly effective at all, but it's actually the opposite. I thought Smith had a really good game. He was one of the Sharks' better forwards. Yes, it doesn't actually lead to point totals, it doesn't lead to offense, but I thought that this trio won their minutes more often than not. The player who I still think is a little bit of a weak link here is definitely Tyler Toffoli, because if we look at this first period where the Sharks were rolling and this trio was actually able to get more offensive zone time, it did feel as though 2 or 3 times when the puck reached Toffoli, the play would just kind of die there. And this is what I have been worried about with this set of players, is that Toffoli doesn't quite have that high-octane style that both Celebrini and Smith offer. You know, Celebrini has it in terms of like his explosiveness with his skating and everything like that. Smith isn't the fastest player, but he plays a fast game in terms of those quick passes and things like that. And well, he kind of likes to slow it down, but he has these quick kind of passes that you have to be very, very ready for. And it feels as though Tyler Toffoli just doesn't quite have that ability. And so this is kind of the player who you're a bit hesitant to tinker with the lineup any more than you already have through the first few games of the season, but it might be time to actually make a bit of a swap in this area. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Eklund, Wenberg, and Skinner. Eklund, I thought, was a pretty good standout, at least in the first 20 minutes of this game. I thought he looked like one of the Sharks' more effective players in that opening period, but it kind of fell off going on from there, and it's not even necessarily a big fault of William Eklund. He's not really being given a ton of support, and I have to look once again at the second line center here, Alex Wenberg, as a big reason for that. I've talked so many times about this. You have your top 6, you need them to be able to contribute. And once again, it can't always just be Celebrini and Smith doing everything. You need that type of depth scoring. The second line shouldn't even be considered depth scoring at this point. This is still part of your top 6, and yet it's just not happening at this point. Alex Wenberg has been on the ice for one singular goal for the Sharks across all of his even strength minutes, and he is amongst the leaders for Sharks forwards in terms of even strength minutes because of just how much trust Ryan Warsofsky actually has in him. This is not good enough for a second line center. You know, he could make a good shutdown 3C, that's fine, but there's a reason why you don't hear people talk about a shutdown 2C. It's because you don't want your second line center to be a shutdown guy where when he's on the ice, nothing happens. You need your second line center to actually be able to score, and Wenberg doesn't have that capability. Now, at the end of last year, after the Sharks had traded away Mikael Granlund, the Sharks didn't have much better options, and so they kind of forced Wenberg into this spot, and he had actually performed rather well there, and so maybe that's what's given them the faith that that can still work out this season. But now the Sharks do have a better option. They have Michael Misa. Yes, that's not a guarantee that if they put Misa with Eklund and Skinner, that it's going to go immensely well and there's going to just be points galore and everybody's going to be excited and it's going to go amazingly. There's no guarantee that that would happen, but it certainly could. You know, it certainly could look better than this, which is Wenberg being on the ice for a single goal. Like, to put that into perspective, Misa has been on the ice for 2 even strength goals despite having almost a third of Wenberg's total even strength ice time. Like, this is not necessarily something that is a huge sacrifice to swap out these players. And the big thing is that just having Misa on the second line, that doesn't mean that he has to be there every single possible shift. If you're on a defensive zone shift with 30 seconds left in the second period for your second line, you can toss Wenberg on there with Eklund and Skinner and not be too hurt for that. But when you're 8 minutes left in the first period in an offensive zone faceoff, it's probably a better idea to have Misa with Eklund and Skinner and see if that offense can actually get rolling, because consistently showing up in these games with very little coming out of your other 3 lines, like, it's a huge risk. As I said, you cannot just depend on your first line to do everything for you every single night. And so, not a big fan of where Wenberg currently finds himself in the lineup. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, this was a trio that did kind of continue rolling a little bit. At least the wingers did. I thought Gaudette had a very effective game here tonight. He was getting some really great chances, all of them really being set up by Colin Graf, who also I thought had an effective game here. So both of these players continuing to do well, but they were obviously kind of having that missing player on the lineup. Misa really tied these two together, was that kind of skilled player who could truly set up these plays. And Kurashev, I don't actually think he was necessarily all that bad here tonight. He had that tip-in goal that otherwise would have counted with if it was just like a few inches lower to the ground, but it wasn't necessarily as great, and perhaps it's because he had missed those last couple of games due to healthy scratch. This early on, being taken out of the lineup for an extended period of time, it certainly does kind of take the wind out of your sails here, but it is actually the reason for why I would like Kurashev to still play while Misa does come back into the lineup, and for somebody else to step out, and that is someone who we find on the Sharks' fourth line. That is Ryan Reaves, and I want to make it very clear that I don't think Ryan Reaves has been bad this season. Like, if you compare it to last year when I was constantly criticizing Barclay Goodrow, the gap between Reaves right now and Barclay Goodrow last season is pretty significant. Like, Goodrow was really bad last year, and at least Reaves is somewhat serviceable for the role that he does fill. But the thing is that it's a different situation this season. Last year, Goodrow was taking the spot of a guy like Carl Grundstrom in the lineup. Like, it wasn't necessarily the end of the world with Goodrow sitting there on that fourth line. But Ryan Reaves is now taking the spot of a guy like Michael Misa. If Reaves is not here, Kurashev probably gets bumped down to the fourth line, which is not a terrible look, and Misa can be at least on the third line, if not bumped to that second line. But instead, the Sharks have Ryan Reaves here, and tonight he plays a grand total of less than 5 minutes of ice time. And in fact, this is even somewhat inflated by the fact that after this empty net goal was scored by Connor Brown, the Sharks sent on their fourth line to play the final 45 seconds of this game. So in reality, Reaves actually had about 4 minutes of ice time. And are we really prioritizing 4 minutes of ice time for Ryan Reaves across a full 59-minute game compared to Michael Misa, your promising 18-year-old prospect who has looked quite good in the NHL thus far? The priorities do seem to be a little bit out of whack. Reaves can be that kind of vibes guy that a lot of people like to hype him up for, while being the 13th forward who plays, a few games here or there, 30, 40 in a particular year. He doesn't have to play 75 games or whatever he might be on pace for at this point, when he can be more so that 13th forward type of guy who gets in when you may need a little bit more of a physical element. So to me, I think Reaves, the value that he's bringing in 4 minutes of ice time is not nearly high enough to justify having a guy like Michael Misa or even Kurashev or definitely Colin Graf ride the bench at this point. Feels like the Sharks should make the obvious decision here. When it comes now to the Sharks defensively, we have the top pairing of Orlov and Liljegren, and I can call them the top pairing because they were really used as that in this particular game. Both Liljegren and Orlov at about 24.5 minutes. The next closest defenseman was Ferraro, who was a good 6 minutes below that. So clearly Warsofsky leaning on both of them. Now obviously Orlov played a good amount on the penalty kill and things of this nature. If you look at even strength ice time, it's a little bit closer, but still these two definitely leading the way, and it's for good reason. I thought both Orlov and Liljegren had solid games. Now, I mentioned earlier on that generally this was a pretty decent even strength defensive game for this defensive core. They didn't necessarily give the Devils a ton to work with. It's a pretty low bar to clear, obviously, but still, and I thought Liljegren and Orlov were a big part of this. It's interesting to see how far Liljegren has come in such short amount of time. If you go back, a few weeks to the preseason, Liljegren really didn't look all that impressive, and I thought he might not even start the year as like a top 6 guy for the Sharks, and now suddenly he's like a top pairing player and not looking that terribly out of place in this spot. Definitely some very great progress, and I liked Liljegren's game here tonight defensively, and also that amazing stretch pass to Colin Graf was impressive near the end of the game. And then when it comes to Dmitry Orlov, it was a bit of a rocky start over those first few games, but it seems as though he's now settled in a little bit more. Pretty good against the Islanders, against the Rangers, and here tonight against the New Jersey Devils. There's always going to be those risky type of plays. For instance, on this Eklund power play goal, he makes a very aggressive move to try and deny a potential break for Jack Hughes. If this doesn't work, you've got a breakaway, maybe even like a 2-on-0 going the other way, but it does, and it turns into a Sharks goal. So that's the type of kind of play that Orlov will go for on a pretty consistent basis, and you're just hoping that it goes well more so than it goes poorly. But Orlov generally has been good for the Sharks over this last week or so, and hopefully that can continue and the Sharks can get some semblance of a top pairing here that a week or 2 weeks ago seemed as though it was nowhere to be found. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Ferraro and Iorio, and I think this is also a pretty good time to mention, and I did kind of allude to it earlier on, no Nick Leddy in the lineup here for tonight's game. He did get injured, and I believe he also won't play on Sunday against the Minnesota Wild. He's out for the rest of this road trip, though it remains to be seen just how serious this injury actually is. So the Sharks, a bit of a different look to their blue line here. Ferraro and Iorio. I thought Iorio, I didn't necessarily notice him a ton. He had that great pass to Jeff Skinner on what would end up being the called off offside goal. But besides that, I didn't necessarily see him much of anything. However, for Iorio, this actually might be a good thing. This was a player who had also somewhat of a rocky start in his start with the San Jose Sharks after being picked up off of waivers. That first game against Utah was not even remotely decent, and so he has slowly improved from there, and I think tonight it wasn't anything super impressive, but he was ultimately pretty decent. And when it comes to his defensive partner Mario Ferraro, I thought Ferraro had a great start to this game. Like his first period, he looked rather good. I always love to see when Ferraro actually showcases a little bit of skill and patience in the defensive zone to look to actually make a play instead of just wildly clearing it out. I always try to call out when he does do this correctly, but then in the second and third period, it kind of faded a little bit. I still think Ferraro had an okay enough game. As I said, that defensively, this team was not too bad here tonight. I thought it was strange, however, that we saw Ferraro paired a lot with Vincent Deharnay. That is a grouping that I don't really want to see much of at all moving forward here in this season, so hopefully we can avoid that a bit. But Ferraro, a game that I thought was not too bad. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, I'll start off actually with Vincent Deharnay, who I have been really impressed with thus far this season. Most games, yesterday against the Rangers, not as great, but I was a little bit more forgiving of that simply because, well, the Sharks won, as well as the fact that he played over 20 minutes of ice time, which is a pretty unusual scenario for him. Here tonight, though, I thought it was a bit of a weak outing as well, so not a great game. And then on the other side, of course, we have Sam Dickinson. Did not play yesterday against the Rangers, gets into the lineup here tonight against the New Jersey Devils. Certainly a big test for him, and I'll say that he definitely passed in my eyes. It was somewhat of a rough start. His first shift, his first couple of shifts, not looking too great, kind of reminiscent of the first game that Shakir Mukhamadullin played this season against the Vegas Golden Knights. Not a great start, just not enough purpose on some of his passes. And then there was the play with Paul Cotter. This is going back to an issue that he had a bit even in preseason. His actual gap control here at the NHL level, maybe not quite where it needs to be just yet. Obviously, you want to keep the attacking player in front of you. You can't give them too much space because then they'll have time to make a ton of plays, but you also don't want to be right up next to them like Dickinson is, because if you're skating backwards and the other player is skating forwards, you're usually going to get burned, and you're going to look like a pylon there. And that's what Paul Cotter is able to pull off here. Puts the shoulder down, protects the puck, goes right around Dickinson, and gets a great chance onto Askarov. So that was a rough look for Dickinson, but from that point onwards, he got better and better and better and really did settle in for the rest of this game. Actually ended up putting up a pretty good defensive effort, which was very nice to see. And the thing is that once he really kind of got things covered in his own zone, it allowed him to be a bit more aggressive in the offensive zone. This is likely something that the Sharks are preaching, right? Like, cover your own scoring, cover your own defensive play, and then try to jump up into the play. And so in the third period, we saw Dickinson get up into the rush a couple of times. It didn't really work out. The execution was a little bit off, but it's nice to see him try to get involved, like going deep in the zone, coming back up the boards, and then goes for the backhand pass. I think to Celebrini, it's off the mark, comes out of the zone. The good news is that if it was off the mark in the zone, it could easily have gone the other way for a breakaway. So worst comes to worst, it just ends up having to vacate and reset. But then there was also a play where he comes into the offensive zone, cuts across the top of the blue line, and then looks for a drop pass. However, while this did lack a little bit in execution, when you're trying to drop pass it to Ryan Reaves, who's probably the last forward you would want to do this to, it's not exactly a smart move, and that is something that Dickinson also will have to improve a little bit on. It's not a major issue, but it's about being aware of who you are on the ice with. This is true, obviously, from a defensive standpoint. If you're against Stefan Nason, you maybe don't have to be as active as if you're defending a guy like Jack Hughes, but it's also the case offensively, where if you're playing with Celebrini and Smith, you can look for some crazy aggressive types of plays, but if you're on with the fourth line, maybe you just sort of send a shot towards the net and see what happens. So Dickinson, that was maybe a bit of a too hopeful play, let's just say, but all in all, it balanced out to, I thought, a really good night for Dickinson. Maybe not his best game of the season, but definitely up there. And what was most important here is that previously, against the Islanders, against the Pittsburgh Penguins, these are not the most difficult of opponents. So the Penguins have had a great start to this season, and honestly, the Islanders have done well as well. But if you go back to an actual, real kind of playoff competitive powerhouse team like Carolina, that was Dickinson's worst game of the entire season by far. He was really bad that night. And so against New Jersey, a similar level of team, you're hoping that he would be able to redeem himself, and I thought he did so exceptionally well. A really good night for Dickinson all in all, like a 7 on 10 type of performance. And then we get to the Sharks goaltender Yaroslav Askarov. It has been a very rough go of things for Askarov thus far this season. He started off with that performance against the Anaheim Ducks, letting in 7 goals, multiple of them ones that he definitely would have wanted back. Then there was 6 goals against Utah. Not the worst of nights necessarily, but still 6 goals looks pretty bad on paper. But there was some improvement in the last one against the New York Islanders. He lets in 4 goals there. One of them was weak, and so you couldn't really say it was a good night for Askarov, but otherwise it didn't necessarily play too badly. And then we see even further improvement tonight. He lets in just 2 goals, both of them on the power play. He came up with some massive saves as well. There was that incredible save on Nico Hischier back in the first period, also on a New Jersey Devils power play. And so Askarov was definitely the best player on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. It's not remotely close. He really did a great job of keeping the Sharks in this game when their penalty kill was maybe allowing way too many chances, much more than they should be. And so as such, it is great to see that Askarov is now turning things around at least a little bit thus far, and I imagine for the final game of this road trip on Sunday, considering Nedeljkovic wasn't great even in the victory yesterday against the Rangers, we might see Askarov actually get back-to-back starts, and hopefully he can also get his first win of the season. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday. They'll be taking on the Minnesota Wild. The Wild haven't had the greatest start thus far to this season, but they are a very dangerous, higher scoring team. They've got Kaprizov, who is the highest paid player in the NHL, which was the big news of the sort of last couple of months. They've got Zeev Buium, who of course many San Jose Sharks fans are interested in following. They've got a solid defensive core generally, and so this is a matchup that is not going to be an easy one for San Jose. We'll see if they can find a way back into the win column. However, class dismissed.